Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to this special April 8th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Zach Bader, and today I'm joined by Brian Waddingham, who's the Executive Director of the Coalition to Support Iowa's Farmers. Brian, you've been on the podcast with us before. Thanks for joining us again.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Brian, of course, spring's a time when a lot of farm projects really start to ramp up, and of course that's especially true on the livestock side, as you well know. So now's a good time for us to remind folks about what the Coalition does and the services that you offer livestock farmers. So let's start right there. For farmers who might not be familiar with the Coalition, can you tell us about the organization and the services that you guys offer farmers?
Sure. So the Coalition, we were formed in 2004 by farmers, for farmers, with the sole purpose of helping Iowa's livestock industry grow successfully and responsibly. And we really offer four key services to help those livestock farmers make responsible decisions to their farms. The first one being siting. We want to make sure that new barn or feedlot is in the best location that it can be. Secondly, we help that farmer interpret the more than 250 pages of rules and regulations that apply to their livestock farm. Third, we work through implementing best management practices such as planting trees and windbreaks through our Green Farmstead Partner Program. And then finally, we work to enhance neighbor relations with that farmer's neighbors and community.
So you referenced neighbor relations there. Talk to us a little bit more about that. Tell us why that's so important and what kind of recommendations that you and the Coalition can offer farmers in that regard, whether a farmer is expanding an operation or just managing a current site.
So the Coalition, we really feel that neighbor relations is maybe the most critical component of adding a new livestock barn or growing an existing farm, or maybe you're even going to just maintain your current numbers, but really having open dialogue with your neighbors goes a long way in helping them understand what you're doing. So for instance, today, a lot of neighbors to livestock farms may be 2 to 3 or 4 generations removed from the family farm. So the memories they have of what happens on farms today could be tied back to grandpa's farm or great-grandpa's farm, and they don't really have a good handle on what happens today. So anytime a farmer can reach out to those neighbors, explain what they do, why they do it, and how they raise their livestock can go a long ways in improving the relationship they have with their neighbors. And typically, neighbor relations isn't the most easy thing to do for a farmer because it does involve knocking on doors and introducing yourself and explaining what you do, why you do it. But we always encourage farmers to do that. Bring your family with, especially if you're going to bring a son or daughter back with livestock. Make sure they're part of that conversation and they get introduced to the neighbors. But again, you're not asking for permission to build. You're just explaining why you are going to proceed with your livestock project and answer any questions that they might have and just give them a better understanding of what it is that you do. And anytime, of course, that you can offer a tour of your livestock farm, if biosecurity permits that, that certainly goes a long way too in helping your neighbors understand what it is you do on your livestock farm.
You talked about regulatory compliance as well, and those 250 pages worth of rules and regulations. That's really just a constantly changing web of rules and regulations that farmers have to be aware of. And of course, regulatory compliance could also involve something like inspections from the EPA or DNR and being ready for that. So can you walk us through that a little bit? How does a farmer become aware that they're going to be inspected by the EPA or DNR? And then how can a farmer best prepare for that kind of inspection?
So yeah, that's a great question. Typically, if you're going to be inspected by EPA, you'll get a phone call the night before they want to carry out the inspection. And the conversation will usually just go, this is EPA Inspector so-and-so. We plan to be at your farm tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. to conduct an inspection. And
how do you verify that it's them in the first place? I mean, how do you know that the person who's calling you is actually somebody from the EPA?
You should always ask to have them read off their credentials. And then when they do arrive at your farm, ask to see identification, ask to see all their credentials, and really make sure that that is an EPA inspector and not someone posing as an EPA inspector.
So Brian, can you walk us through now the detail of what that inspection is going to entail? Again, how a farmer can prepare for that, and then in the moment, the things that farmer should be doing.
So prior to the inspection, you could have the coalition come out and assess your farm, make sure you're in compliance, make sure the inspector is not going to surprise you with anything that they see. Because as we mentioned before, the 250 pages of rules and regulations out there, they do change. And just because you were in compliance 5 years ago doesn't mean necessarily you're in compliance today. So having that third party like the coalition come out can go a long ways in giving you peace of mind that your farm's going to pass an inspection. During that inspection, you should have a point of contact identified, which is typically the owner of the facility, but also, if possible, have a second person to accompany the farmer, whether it's a family member or hired help. Have them there to also document what is being said. Always a great idea to cooperate with the inspector, but just don't speculate. If you're asked a question and you're not entirely sure of the answer, it's perfectly fine to say, I can get back to you on that because I'm not sure. Don't think you have to answer the questions that are asked that day. And then during that inspection, you can ask questions. Also a great idea to take notes, document what is being discussed. If the inspector takes photos, you or the other point of contact should also take photos, and just really keep a thorough log of what was discussed during the visit. And then once the inspection's over, make sure that you ask the inspector for a report. If that report comes or they do a follow-up phone call or need more information, please provide that in a very timely manner because you want to be as cooperative as you can during the inspection as well as after the inspection.
And some folks might be wondering, Brian, should I be recording this myself? Should I have my phone out and recording a video or at least recording the audio of what's going on? What's your recommendation there?
You know, it's probably not necessary, but if it makes you feel a little more comfortable knowing that the entire conversation was documented, you can certainly do that. But typically we find that just a good set or two of notes, as well as documenting everything photo-wise that was taken by the inspector, usually will suffice.
And Brian and the coalition have put together a really nice document that kind of explains some of these steps that he's recommending here. Again, if you have EPA or DNR, someone reach out to you for an inspection, what are the tips that they would recommend on that? We will be sure to link that document to the notes for this podcast episode, so you can go ahead and click down there after you listen here. Again, it'll be down in the episode notes. How about any other tips?
Well, I think farmers really should be proactive when it comes to these inspections. And it's not just the production area the inspector will be looking at. They'll also be looking at your feed source, manure stockpiles, compost stockpiles. And, you know, with 250 pages of rules and regs, they are always evolving. There's always little tweaks being done. So maybe you were in compliance 5 years ago, but if you haven't read through those rules or had someone explain and interpret those rules and how they would impact your farm, it's always a good idea to get a refresher, have the coalition come out, and we'd be glad to work with you and make sure you're following the most current set of rules and regulations that apply to your farm. No matter the size of livestock farm today or the production practice, whether it's open feedlots or confinements, there are rules and regulations for all sizes of livestock farms today. So it's always a good idea to have someone come out, provide that second set of eyes, and give you peace of mind that your farm would pass an inspection and that you are following all the rules and regulations, both state and federal. So give the coalition a call. We can come right out to the farm, provide a no-cost and confidential farm visit to give you peace of mind that you are in compliance with the more than 250 pages of rules and regulations out there today.
And so if folks want to get a hold of the coalition, reference giving you a call, what's that number they should call?
So yeah, if you would like to visit over the phone or have us come out to your farm and take a look and provide an assessment of your farm, give us a call, 800-932-2785. 888-2436, or you can always find us on the web at supportfarmers.com.
Appreciate that, Brian. Thank you for your time. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here with Brian, talking about some advice for building neighbor relations and some great tips for handling potential inspections. By the way, Brian referenced verifying your EPA inspector's credentials. Each EPA inspector should have a badge with a photo and a number that could be verified if you called the Kansas City EPA office. But of course, you can always make the Coalition to Support Iowa's Farmers your first call with questions about livestock rules, regulations, and more. Again, that number for the Coalition is 800-932-2436. We'll be sure to include that phone number, the Coalition's website, and the Coalition's helpful guide with tips for farmers who are going through an EPA inspection, which is full of some great information and recommendations. We'll include all of that in the notes for this podcast episode, so you can check down there after you're done listening here. Brian, thanks for carving out some time for us today. I know that spring is a busy time for your team. Those calls are going to start ramping up for you guys, and hopefully we'll be sending a few more your way here from folks listening to this podcast.
Thank you.
So that wraps up this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope that you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for the next one on April 18th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything that we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.